Good evening. Can everyone hear me? They can't hear me.
He's Mike, you're not.
Oh.
Project.
All right, so I use my teacher voice. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am the library director, Pamela Monroe, and I would like to welcome you to our library lecture series, the first one for 2022. Leon County has hosted the library lecture series for the past 5 years, and in that time, we've heard from more than a dozen local, regional, and national speakers who engage and inspire the community with thoughtful discussions about topics of the arts and sciences. And we are very proud to have Mark Friedemann here tonight as a part of this series and to kick off our 2022 library lecture series. This lecture is taking place on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day to honor and remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazism. Tonight, we will hear from Mark about his father, Richard Friedemann, a native of Poland who survived the horrors of the Holocaust. Through historical photographs and artifacts, we will learn about Richard's remarkable life growing up in Poland, his experiences in the forced labor and death camps, liberation, and rebuilding of his life after fleeing to the United States. Though Richard passed away in 2019, his memories and stories live on through his son. After the lecture, Mark will be taking questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask that you hold them, please. And now, everyone, please join me in welcoming Mark Friedemann.
Good evening, everyone. I'm mic'd up, so I'm not a professional speaker by any means, so you'll have to forgive my nervousness and the potential for some salty language. But I want to thank you all for attending on this day of remembrance and taking the time out to hear this rather harrowing story that I'm about to tell you. I can't really fully go into detail about everything. Can you?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let the technical guys go this.
That's what we're here for. Let's do this.
I can't really tell you. There's so much to go through. There's so many stories. There's so many different things to cover, but I'm going to give you the best synopsis I can of this really miraculous journey that my father survived. With that said, these are historical facts that are not in dispute, and I'm going to reveal to you sort of the terrible details of my father's young life. It's going to contain photographs and depictions that pretty much all of you are going to find disturbing. When you see the little exclamation point, 3 of them there, the next slide is going to be tough. There's no getting around it. And the reason I've included these depictions is, as we all know, there are people who deny to this day that the Holocaust happened, or they say, oh, it's greatly exaggerated. And I'm here to dispute that, refute that, and basically tell you just one story. And there are many stories like this that are easily available on YouTube or in movies or books. There are multiple examples of sort of the same sort of thing that my father went through. I want to thank the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, Friedemann Family Trust, and so many others for what you're about to see. Our story starts in, I pronounce it Kraków. That's the way Polish people pronounce it. Americans would say Krakow, Poland. And this is the, where's the button? Here it is. This is the old city of Kraków. And this greenway area, which the Polish call the Planty, is where the old city wall was. And this area down here, this is the south. This is a Wawel Castle. And this, this old city wall is around the largest, and in my opinion, the most wonderful main square in Europe. It is a fantastic place. If you ever get to visit Poland, Kraków is a must visit area. You have to see it. Multiple historic sites. This is St. Mary's Basilica, famous statuary. This is called the Cloth Hall. The National Museum is on the upper floor, and down here are kiosks, different shops and things. It's a fantastic tourist location. Again, St. Mary's Basilica. This thing has been around for ages. In fact, there's a bugler who plays up here on the hour, every hour. And during the time of Kublai Khan, if you remember your history, they actually raided this far north. And one of the Kublai Khan's archers actually killed the bugler while he was playing. And to this day, every hour on the hour, the bugler plays the song and abruptly stops at the point where he was killed by an arrow from Kublai Khan's troops. This is Wawel Castle. Construction of this castle began in 970 AD. It's the absolute first World Heritage Site ever listed, and it is in amazing shape. And they've done a wonderful job restoring and preserving all of the buildings in here. You'll notice this building right here. This is actually a new addition. The Nazis built this when they took over the area. That is a kind of a weird addition to the castle. Also, just a point of interest, this gold dome you see is actually gold. And during World War II, it was painted with tar so that the Nazis didn't basically steal it. And then toward the end of the war, they actually discovered that it was gold, and they started to dismantle the dome. And the partisans that operated in the area basically told the Nazis, you touch that dome, and we are going to start a campaign of harassment in this area that you're not going to forget. The Nazis left it alone. Kraków is the historic and cultural center of Poland. It is now filled with art and museums, and it was the capital of Poland for many years. It's now in Warsaw. But a lot of these artworks that you're seeing here, these are all artworks by an artist named Matejko. These were all looted and were returned to Poland over the years after World War II. This is a photograph inside the National Museum in the Cloth Hall that I described to you above the main floor. It's a wonderful museum. There are so many museums in this area. It is absolutely fantastic how much history and culture you can find just within a few city blocks in Kraków. And of course, Polish food is absolutely famous. And like a good Pole, I enjoy eating, and eating food in Kraków is an amazing experience. There's a lot of old Polish kitchens and new restaurants, and it's an amazing place to dine. This particular story I'm about to tell you starts in December of 1927, and my father was born in this suite of rooms up here. This is number 11 Main Square, Kraków, Poland. And you'll notice this is actually in the main square. Here's St. Mary's Basilica, another small church here, the Cloth Hall. He was born in these rooms. He was the second son of a up-and-coming Polish lawyer. His name was Leon, and his mom's name was Lilla. His brother's name was Zygmunt. So these are the people that I'm going to be talking about. Shortly after my dad was born, they moved into this house. And this house, strangely enough, is number 11 Karmelitska. And I will just tell you up front, there are some very odd numerical coincidences that sort of occur throughout my father's life. This building was built in 1898. My dad's address in Atlantic Beach, Florida was 1898, Salva Marina Drive. So anyway, these kind of weird numerological things, I don't know. I place no real meaning on it. It just is strange. Oh, there's one other thing here. Shortly after they bought this home, they added a floor onto it. And my grandmother, Lilla, actually signed those plans for the addition of this room. This signature actually becomes very important in the future. So keep that in mind. My father lived a very comfortable life. His family was, no bones to pick or anything. They were rich. They had a lot of success. And the house I just showed you, offices were on this floor. My dad's family lived on this floor. My grandfather's brother, Heinrich, lived on this floor. And on the floor that was built after they bought it up here was another brother. So the whole family lived in this house all together, and they all had offices down here on the bottom floor. So he lived a very nice life, fine food, artwork, education. These were priorities in the family as well as in other families. In September of 1939, that all came to an abrupt and difficult end. Under what we now call a false flag operation, the Nazis got some prisoners, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and promised them amnesty. All they had to do was go attack this radio transmitter station right near the border of Poland. And of course, they wanted amnesty, so they did it. They attacked the transmitter station. The SS rolled up, murdered all of the prisoners, and then took photographs and said, oh, the Polish attacked the transmitter station. That's an act of war, and the invasion began. The first thing to happen at 4 a.m. was the battleship Holstein opened fire point blank on the port city of Danzig, which was manned by a small garrison of Polish military people, and strangely enough, post office workers. So these poor post office workers basically held off the Germans for 15 hours. They were eventually captured and all of them were executed. So this was the world's first taste of an absolutely new kind of warfare called blitzkrieg. And now this word gets bandied about quite a bit nowadays. It's also in the parlance of American military forces now called maneuver warfare. But there's something really strange about the German blitzkrieg in that they seemed unstoppable, and the attacks just went on and on, even throughout the night. And what has become recently known and verified is that the Wehrmacht, which is the German army, was supplied with a drug called Pervitin. And we know that drug is crystal meth. It's the same thing. And so the entire Wehrmacht army was supplied with crystal meth during the early phases of the war. And many of the Wehrmacht soldiers became addicted to it and had psychotic episodes and behaved in a manner that might be common in people who are addicted to such drugs. So this is a map of sort of what happened in the early stages of the war. The Nazis came from the west and A lot of people don't realize this. The Soviets came from the east they were actually supposed to come early, like within a couple of days of the German attack, but Stalin, being the terrible, evil psychopath that he is, he waited until the 16th, 17th of September to come the other direction. During the early phase of the war, you'll remember Leon, my dad's father, and his brother Zygmunt, they were in the Army Reserves, so they went to the front to fight the Nazis. My father, Richard, and his mother, Lila, were very close to the front lines, so they left Krakow. This is Krakow in southern Poland. This is a town that I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of. And this is Lviv, which used to be Polish, used to be a Polish city. It's now in the Ukraine. It's now called Lviv. But their idea, they had friends and relatives in this area. So their idea was to flee Krakow by train and go to Lviv. Well, they didn't make it very far. They got to somewhere right in here. In this area, there's a forest called the Nipolmitsa Forest, and their train was attacked by Stukas and Hinkel bombers, which strafed the train for 3 days. There were a number of trains, and my dad told me that one of the trains was a Red Cross train, had Red Cross emblems all over it. It was basically moving wounded, and that train was bombed, and those people on the train were killed. Many of the people on his train were killed. They ran from the cars they were in, and these were not like regular passenger cars. There was such a desperate need to get out that they just loaded into whatever cars were available. 3 days of strafing and bombing, and my 10, 11-year-old dad witnessed people being pulverized, killed by machine gun fire, and basically blown to bits. Again, this shows the movements. Here's Danzig. This was actually called the Free City of Danzig after the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. Danzig was basically a free city. It was not owned by the Germans. It was not owned by the Polish, but it was kind of operated jointly by several nations. This is where the Polish post office workers were fighting and were all killed. This is Lviv, where Richard and Lila fled to. And this is Krakow. You can see that the Nazi forces basically came in very big sweeping pincer movements, part of the Blitzkrieg operation. My dad actually witnessed the Soviet scouts on the 16th cross the San River and the Bug and enter into the area around Lviv, and very quickly following those motorcycle scouts, the Soviet armored columns came through. Poland and Russia had a very difficult relationship already, and Poles, whether it was justified or not, considered Russians barbarians. So Richard and my dad and his mom wanted to get back over into the German occupied area. Germans were considered a little bit more civilized, a little bit more intelligent, and they had no way of knowing just how cruel the Nazis were going to be. But at that moment, they considered Russians, Germans, okay, Germans. But the Germans and Russians had established a line of demarcation, which was heavily guarded. So they actually had to be smuggled across the river to get back to Krakow, but that's what they did. Leaving Lviv was definitely the right decision. And again, if you noticed the three little marks down here, these are some tough pictures, but these are important pictures to show you because what I'm going to tell you may be a surprise to you, maybe it won't be, but if you'll notice in these pictures, there aren't really any soldiers doing anything. The Nazis are not killing people. This little kid has a stick in his hand. This woman is being by all intents and purposes, she was probably murdered. But she's being chased by a crowd who are tearing her clothes off and beating her. She's bleeding out of her nose and mouth. There's a soldier here, and he's just standing there. These are not soldiers. They're dragging someone out of a courtyard area that they've beaten. These two pictures are the same people. These are all civilians. This poor girl, again, has been beaten, and likely these two were murdered. But they were not murdered by Nazis. They were murdered by people who were incited to hate Jewish people. Again, there's a soldier right here. He's not doing anything. He's watching. These are civilians that are carting dead Jews away. This happened in southern Poland and areas now under in the Ukraine. Entire villages were murdered. Entire towns were eliminated based on these hatreds and jealousies that were fomented for many, many years prior to World War II breaking out. So Lila and Richard fled back to Krakow, and they made it back. And when they got home, they found Leon at their home. They were very happy about that. Of course, Zygmunt was not there. Zygmunt joined Army Krajowa, which was the Polish underground, and was doing whatever he was doing. He was basically spying for the Allies. This began one of the most diabolical and systematic campaigns of destruction aimed directly at Polish and Jewish culture. And these psychopaths, that's what I'm going to call them, they were so hell-bent on destruction that I don't know what these are called. These are little paper things that kids used to play with. Kids nowadays wouldn't know what these are. But back in the day, they had these little fold-up paper things. You manipulate them, and then a little picture comes out. Well, this guy did one of these little things, and at the end, there was a cartoon of Hitler. It was making fun of him. Well, they hunted that guy down and killed him. And they destroyed, remember the statue I showed you in the main square of Krakow? That's that statue. They destroyed it. Not only did they destroy the statue, they hunted down the artists who made these statues. And if they could find them, they murdered them. There's another statue that I'll show you later called the Battle of Grunwald. And that artist, he knew. So he hid all of the casts for the statue because he knew they would destroy the statue. And he fled to Denmark and hid in Denmark for the entirety of the war. When the war ended, he came back, rebuilt the statue. And you'll see that later on. But this was commonplace. And none of these pictures that I show you can really capture what was going on there. There weren't cell phones, there was no social media. The news didn't travel like it travels now. People didn't really understand what was happening until it was right on top of them. Civilians were murdered in the droves. You know, they say 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. That's kind of an estimate. Those numbers come from what happened in the concentration camps and some of the other massacres and killing fields. There are many, many places that just disappeared where they weren't counted. These people got dropped into ditches and holes and covered over by the thousands. Shortly after returning to their home in Krakow, they were betrayed by, and we know this now from research we've done, they were betrayed by a neighbor across the street. His name was Petron. He was a dentist. And he lived in this little house across the street. But his windows on his upper floor looked almost directly into the second floor of my dad's home. And so the Gestapo showed up, and they already had sort of an inventory of things in the house that they were looking for. And the family was terrorized. Leon was taken to the basement and pistol whipped and threatened with execution on the spot. A number of Gestapo men entered into the home and began taking things and cataloging things. And the family was thrown out onto the street with, they were allowed to take 30 kilos of personal items with them. At that point, they realized that survival in Krakow was going to be extremely difficult. And so they fled Krakow. If you did not cooperate with the SS, this was your fate. And there are lots of different photos that are much more graphic than I could have shown, but this is just to get the point across. Thousands of families were displaced, their homes looted, their belongings thrown out on the street to be pilfered through and just basically turned into garbage. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. In March of 1941, Edict 4491 was put in place by the Nazis. These are the copies of the actual order. This basically describes a Jewish district being created on the south end of the Vistula River in about a 16 by 16 block area where all Jews in the area of Krakow and surrounding villages and towns were to be put. Jews were forced also by another edict to wear a Star of David somewhere on their clothing. This is an actual photo of Jews being herded into the ghetto. So my family fled to a village east of Krakow, and this village is called Warwinczyce. It doesn't look like that's how it would be pronounced. That's pretty close. I won't claim it's perfect. This person right here her name is Adela Pilsch. And my dad sent in an application to Yad Vashem, basically asking to make her into righteous among the nations. Sorry. This family saved. This family saved my family's life. My dad was terrified to go back here after the war because he was really expecting them to have been murdered. But in 2014, we went back and we found out that they survived. And so this is how we got these pictures. We actually talked to the great granddaughter and great grandson of Adela. Thanks. That's my wife. She's really great. This is that trip when my dad went back. This is my dad actually coming out of the house that he hid in when he was like 11 years old. This is the grave site of Adela Pilsch and her husband, and this is the priest that we talked to about this whole ordeal. It's kind of an interesting story. We talked to the priest. The priest was very cagey. He didn't really let on that the Pilsches had family members that were still alive. So the day that we were scheduled to leave Krakow and fly back to the States, I got a call on my cell phone, and it was the administrator of my dad's old house. And he said, someone has called and they're saying that they know your father, they know of your father. And I said, well, who is it? And they said the name, and I was like, oh my God. So anyway, it was the Pilsch family. So we reconnected with those people. And it was an amazing reunion. But anyway, they could not stay in Warwin-Schütze because there is a formation within the Nazi army called the Einsatzgruppen. And some of these formations were also called Sonderkommando, which is kind of odd because there's another group called Sonderkommando. It's a little bit confusing, but the Einsatzgruppen were SS formations who their sole job was to hunt for hidden Jewish people and kill them. And this is what you see right here. This is an Einsatzgruppen formation, and they're about to murder all these people that you see here in the ditch. And this happened time and time again in all areas of Poland, in areas in Russian. Once the Germans invaded Russia, it happened in Germany. This is a relatively famous picture of Einsatzgruppen basically murdering a family. And here are bodies, and this poor guy is about to get executed. In the early stages of the war, the Germans found it easy enough to kill people using machine guns, rifles, pistols. But after a while, this started to have a negative impact on the soldiers who were murdering innocent victims. And so they had to devise different ways to murder Jewish people, Poles, Czechs, undesirables of all kinds. So the family fled back to occupied Krakow. Zygmunt had actually joined them in Warwin-Schütze for some time, but when he realized they had to leave Warwin-Schütze, he went back and joined his underground unit, and he sort of disappeared from the scene. So Leila, Leon, and Richard returned to Krakow, but they didn't really have anywhere to stay. So Leila was hid in one place, and Richard and Leon basically changed hiding places almost on a nightly basis. And every day they would meet in this part of the Greenbelt, the Planty, as the Polish call it, and Leila would bring them food. And one day she didn't show up. So it became clear that she had been betrayed and arrested. And this is why, for many years, my dad was terrified that the Pilsch family was executed, because Adela Pilsch, and the reason my dad applied for her to become righteous in the nations is because she gave my dad's mom her identity papers, which is a huge crime. So when she was caught, it's likely that those papers were found and that they knew that the Pilsch family had hidden a Jewish family. And so generally what would happen is the Einsatz formation would go into a town, and they wouldn't just kill the family, they would kill everyone in the town. And so we found out from this priest that I showed a picture of, the Nazis had come to Warwin-Schütze, and not necessarily to find my dad's family by any means, but there was someone there producing false papers, identity papers. And they found that guy, and they murdered him. And then they were going to murder the whole village. They were going to raise it. And the priest actually got in his horse and buggy and rode all the way to Krakow and begged Hans Frank to spare the village, and the village was spared. So many years later, we went back and found this family still alive, which was a great relief to my father. Unfortunately, Lila was taken to a prison called Montelupisch. It is in Krakow. It is a facility that the Poles had stopped using as a prison. It was considered medieval and just kind of barbaric and nasty, so they didn't use it. The Nazis found it to be a fine facility to use to torture and murder people. Lila was there for probably a week, and then she was murdered. At this point, Richard and Leon understood that their life was, they felt basically over. And so for a while, they just wandered around the streets of Krakow thinking, well, we'll get picked up and shot, and that'll be that. That didn't happen. For whatever reason, they walked around as much as possible, and no one said anything to them. So they ended up sneaking into the ghetto because it was safer in the ghetto than it was on the streets. This is the Krakow ghetto, and these are, you know, pictures of families moving their stuff there. The ghetto walls were basically constructed to look like tombstones. The Nazis were extremely, I don't even know the word really. They were just obsessed with tormenting and torturing people. So this was the construction of the ghetto walls. It was a 16 by 16 block area. And this is probably the toughest set of pictures in the presentation. Orphan children suffered the most. Once the children lost their parents, there was really no one there to care for them. So they, almost in every case, they starved to death because food was extremely scarce. Illness was everywhere. Same thing, same fate befell older people that were ill or had disabilities. These people were all almost instantly eliminated. My dad spoke of so many different atrocities in the ghetto. Nazis would randomly drive through the ghetto and machine gun people randomly. Or snipers would be in buildings outside the ghetto and just take pot shots at people on the streets. And many were killed this way. At some point, I can't quote you the date, but at some point, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated. And that's the terminology that the Germans used. They liquidated places, which means they basically got everyone out, either by murdering them or sending them off to Auschwitz for immediate murder in the gas chambers or to become slave labor. And in this case, my father and his father were sent to Plaszow concentration camp. Plaszow is the camp that was the subject of Schindler's List, if you've seen the movie. It was a horrible place. I can't say enough or tell you enough stories about how absolutely terrible this place was. It was run by a guy named Amon Goeth. He was a sadistic psychopath extraordinaire. He murdered people on a daily basis. He would sit on his balcony in the mornings and shoot people from the balcony of his house. My dad witnessed him murder. One guy was murdered about 3 feet from my father while he was working. The guy just made a mistake. You were not allowed to have any possessions as a prisoner. And this guy mistakenly took out a photo of his family, and Amon Goeth saw it and went over to act like he was interested in the photograph. And so he asked the guy, "Oh, is this a photograph of your family?" And the guy said, "Yes." I think he realized what a horrible mistake he had made. But so he conversed with the commandant for a short time. Then Goeth takes a picture of his family out and shows the prisoner, and the prisoner remarks on the picture. And Goeth tells him, "Get back to work." And the guy turned around, got his shovel, and acting like he was walking away, Gareth unholstered his pistol, walked up behind the guy and shot him in the back of the head, killed him. That was just 3-4 feet away from where my father was working. He would sick his dogs on people. He had, this is him. This is an actual picture of him. This is not Ralph Fiennes from the movie. This is an actual picture of Eamon Goeth on his balcony with his rifle. These are his dogs. He had a Great Dane, and I'm not sure what that is, but he would sick those dogs on people all the time. They'd be torn to pieces. My dad described a guard who was in this camp who would gleefully pick up prisoners and break their backs over his knee and kill them. This was hell on earth. Strangely enough, Zygmunt got caught in a roundup. The Germans used to just cordon off streets, and anyone on the street just got swept up and questioned. Well, Zygmunt was sort of suspicious, so they questioned him, they tortured him, and he was spying, but he didn't admit to that. Thank God. He just said, "I'm Jewish and I was hiding." And so they tortured him for a while. And then along with all the other prisoners at Montelupus that were there that week, they took him to the mass grave in Plaszow and just started going down the line, executing people. And for whatever bizarre, strange reason, Zygmunt and one other guy were left, and they either ran out of bullets or they got bored of killing people. And Zygmunt and this other guy were sent into Plaszow. Zygmunt was pretty skilled, and so he got a job in the camp working on some sort of survey type crew. And eventually Richard, Zygmunt, and Leon were reunited in the camp. Unfortunately, after a short time after their reunion, Leon became ill, and he came down with typhus, which was a disease that was prevalent in those days and ran through a lot of the camps. And it was a tremendously difficult illness to overcome. Leon got so sick that it was clear he was not going to recover on his own. So he was taken to the infirmary in the camp where they murdered him. My dad would go and try to check on him, and they wouldn't allow him in, but my dad could hear his father moaning in the infirmary room. And so one day he went back and they told him, "No, your dad died." And so they did not want Leon buried in the mass grave. And so that night, Richard and Zygmunt snuck out of their barracks, went to the hospital. There was a cart outside the hospital where bodies were just piled up, and those bodies would be taken to the mass grave and dumped. Well, they pulled Leon's body out of the grave, out of the cart, and they basically smuggled his body under one of the internal wires and dug a hand-dug grave and buried their father inside of Plaszow concentration camp. That actually becomes significant later on, which I'll discuss in a while. This is actually one of the headquarter offices that was used in Plaszow. This is called the Gray House. This was the SS headquarters where they tortured people, murdered people, and they housed SS officers here. It's now just an apartment building. The site of Plaszow is a terribly neglected, unkept tragedy, is what it is. The Soviets did not want World War II discussed when they took over Poland. The Soviets considered everyone a victim of Hitler, and they made no special dispensation for anything. They didn't memorialize anything. So this area, unfortunately, there are parts of Plaszow that are, one area was turned into a water treatment plant. Another area has been, there's a residential area built on it. But this is as you noticed from the sign in this earlier slide, even in English, you see please respect the grievous history. That didn't happen until after the Soviets left, because they did not respect this history. Plashew concentration camp is actually built on top of a Jewish cemetery. And so it's not really a controversy. It's been made into a controversy, but there are some people who say that the defiling of tombstones and using them to make roads is not true. That's what this is. I'll show you some photos later proving that point as well. This is a memorial that is on top of what's called Hoya Gurka, which means Pricks Hill. And this is where the executions occurred. There were two mass execution sites. One is right over here, and the other one is just kind of this way in this picture. And these are Jewish tombstones that were used to pave a road. There used to be a YouTube video showing the Nazis blowing up this building, and it's been taken down for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but it's no longer available. But this is a pre-burial hall for the Jewish. Have a lot of different rituals in regard to their funeral process. This building was turned into rubble, along with all the gravestones in this cemetery. Again, this is the gray house. The villa that Amin Geth shot people from was put up for sale on the private market. Someone bought it, believe it or not. This whole area should be part of some type of memorial site. Supposedly something like that is going to happen, but I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. This is my father, Richard, and he's talking with this guy. His last name is Kartova. He has written probably the most authoritative book on Plashew Camp. It's available online. I think somewhere over here there's a copy of the cover page to it, but it's not, you know, fun reading, but it's interesting. So remember when I told you that my dad and his brother dug a hand-dug grave for his father? That became a big issue because at the end of the war, the Germans realized that they were going to be in a lot of trouble when people found these mass graves. And so all of the mass graves were dug up and the remains were taken to the shores of the Vistula River and they were burned. So there really is no evidence, and this is all Plashew Camp right in here. There is no evidence of any death having occurred inside this camp. We mentioned in passing to someone that my grandfather is buried there in a hand-dug grave. And this guy was like, what? Oh my God. So they've been actually out there searching with ground penetrating radar to see if they can find his grave, because it would be, there's a story behind it, and it would be proof of the atrocities that were committed on this site. This is actually a gravestone, and obviously it's been destroyed. It's been knocked over, and it was used to build roads. This is my dad in the Schindler Museum. This is these are old photographs these are rare. These are hard to find, but this is a photograph of Plashew Camp and photograph of prisoners at work. And here is the, I won't say it, but this criminal he got caught after the war. He was hiding and disguised himself. He'd lost a lot of weight, and but he was caught and employed the excuse, I was only following orders. And he was hung. Actually, his hanging is, you can see it in a documentary about one of his prisoners enslaved and forced to work in his villa. Her name was Helen Hirsch. If you searched under her name, you could probably find the document. I can't remember the name of it, but the documentary is quite startling. It puts Helen Hirsch and Almond Geth's great granddaughter in the same room, and it is something to see. Again, I've kind of glossed over a few things. One of the things that saved my dad's life was during his internment in Plaszow, a Nazi at some point walked into an area and said, "Are there any metal workers in here?" My dad was lucky and clever. He immediately shot his hand up. "I'm a metal worker." And of course he wasn't. But the Germans, being the way they were, they made note of everything. So on my dad's papers, they marked him down as a metal worker. And this is a very critical job in the war effort. So he was sort of instantly put in the position of having a little bit more importance in the camp, so to speak. Unfortunately, while that did afford him some benefits, if you can call them that, he was injured as a metal worker. He got a piece of metal in his eye and it swelled up. And so one day he was selected, and being selected is not good. So he was selected and basically forced onto a transport, which, I mean, he didn't know where he was going. And his brother, who I also consider a hero, his brother basically forced his way onto the transport. He did not want his brother to go somewhere without him. So Zygmunt basically was beaten the entire way getting onto the transport. You know, he basically said, "I volunteer to go on the transport," and the Germans just laughed at him, beat the living tar out of him as he made his way to the transport. This is one of those weird kind of unknowns that I've recently uncovered. You know, I'm still involved in research and finding out stuff. And literally last week, I made sort of a major breakthrough. But one of the things that I discovered recently was they didn't go from Plaszow to Auschwitz immediately. After Plaszow, this transport took my dad to a place called the Hermann Goering Werke. And I'm going to butcher this name. It's in a little village called Ostrowitz Świętokrzyski. This is a very small town. And I assume it is a sub-camp of Plaszow. And they were taken there, and I think my father thought Plaszow was probably the worst place in the world. And unfortunately, he was wrong. So this place was bad, and people died here regularly just from being overworked and beaten and shot. And fortunately for my father, this camp was liquidated relatively quickly. And again, liquidated means the prisoners are basically put on a transport and off they go to whatever place. And so again, another transport, and on this one, they ended up in Auschwitz. I'm sure you've all heard of Auschwitz. It's probably the most famous extermination camp that has been described in World War II. A lot of people will tell you that, oh, well, people did not know that this was going on. I beg to differ. This is a document that was produced in December of 1942 that was addressed and presented to the governments of the United Nations in 42, entitled "The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-Occupied Poland." There was a very famous Polish officer, his name was Jan Karski. He actually snuck into Auschwitz and then snuck out. Now that's saying something. But his findings are the guts of this report. So the world knew, and the world chose to really do nothing. These were not small sites. These were huge industrial encampments. This is Auschwitz I, and this is Birkenau, also called Auschwitz II. This is the camp my dad was in. and the crematoria are back here, and there's crematoria in here as well. These camps are not just out in the middle of nowhere, they're associated with industry. So the Germans had this massive economic program of using slave labor to produce goods and not pay the workers. In fact, to kill the workers. These people were worked to death. They were not fed well. They were tattooed. They were tortured. They were experimented on. You name it, it happened to them. This is Plaszów. This is in Kraków, Poland, very close to the city center. This is Dachau. This is another camp my dad was in. And this is Auschwitz-Birkenau. These are photographs that I took on a trip in '96 to Auschwitz with my father. This is a contemporary picture, and these are pictures from Auschwitz. This is actually a picture of what's called selection. And in this area, don't ask me why, it has nothing to do with the country, but this area is called Canada. This is spelled with a K. This is where people are selected by folks like Dr. Mengele and others. And one line is death and the other line is slave labor. And my father was fortunately put in the line for slave labor along with his brother. But many people went immediately to the gas chambers. My dad witnessed a number of atrocities just during the one selection he went through. One of the most horrifying tales he told was involving a daughter, young girl, probably 5 or 6 years old, and her mother, which of course they were separated. She was going to slave labor, she was going to the gas chamber. The child did not like being separated from the mother, which is for obvious reasons. And so the child kept running to get back to the mother. And I think finally the mother, and this is an assumption my dad made, the mother finally decided that she was just going to go with the daughter and to her death. And so the mother got out of line, came toward the daughter ran out of her line, came toward the mother. The Nazis didn't like this much, so they bayoneted the child through the neck and shot the mother. And this kind of occurrence was repeated over and over again in these lines. People were beaten to death. People were killed by dogs. People died in the cars. Oftentimes, these cars were low priority. So oftentimes the railroad trains would just stop for a day as troop trains went by. No food, no water, no place to relieve yourself. And so these cattle cars became basically containers of death. As I said before, these sites are enormous. And of course, at the end of the war, normally what you would have seen down here is a big building and smokestacks sticking up. But the Nazis knew that they would be held accountable, so they blew them up. Strangely enough, the Nazis formed an orchestra from the slaves in the camp to play these nice melodies as people were being marched to their death or worked to death or marched back and forth from work details. There is one actual video of the orchestra playing in Auschwitz. It's on YouTube. You type that in and you'll find it. These are the barracks for the prisoners, and it's just, you know, rows of wooden slats there was no bedding, and there was probably about 1,000 people in a barracks, and there was barely enough room you could hardly move in your bunk at night. It is a singularly strange place to visit. There is a certain cloyiness, and it's just a very odd place. I've been there a couple times, and it's never been sunny or nice out. It's always this very kind of overcast and dismal place. These are actually some of the tools they used to basically work people to death. So this is just something that they forced people to pull around during the day for no real reason. My dad was, like I've said already, extremely lucky and also extremely clever. And I'm not a religious person by any means, but there is some sort of miraculous component to his survival. There are a couple of events that happened here that are worth mentioning. Just the act of sharing bread has great implications. So my father and his brother somehow got the job of splitting the bread. And so they had the ability to sort of rig the system, so to speak. And so some prisoners showed up, they happened to be Russians. Some prisoners showed up and they were in very, very bad shape. They were likely to die that night. My father, still being young and maybe a little bit idealistic, he shared bread with them and they survived. And he thought really nothing of it. And then one day, my father woke up and he had a terrible infection. His throat had swollen up, side of his face was very swollen. Every morning, the Nazis lined everyone up and inspected them. And my dad was selected for death. And so he was pulled out of the ranks and made to stand over here, along with a number of other people. At some point, another person was selected and they took off running. And so the Nazis immediately focused on this guy who was shot. And then, of course, there was a bit of commotion and then they went to get the body. During that time, the same group of Russian prisoners who my dad had shared bread with were working on a road crew. And they had a cart and they were picking and putting down rocks. And they wheeled the cart up close to where my father was. And they looked at him and were like, get over here. And my father instantly knew what was happening. He removed his concentration camp jacket, threw it in the cart, and acted like he was part of the work crew. And he escaped death. But this presented a new problem because he was obviously marked for death. So his concentration camp number, B4112, was now on a list, basically, you're dead. So he had to get rid of his jacket and had to find a new jacket. So he snuck into barracks and found someone who had died during the night and took their jacket. Cece, can you? So my wife is gonna pick out a little surprise. This is my father's concentration camp uniform. And if you'll notice in the front here, you'll see some stitching. This is a pocket that he sewed into his jacket. And being a metal worker, he was able to fabricate a spoon for himself, because when you got meals from the Germans, they didn't give you a bowl. You basically put your hands out like this and they poured soup into your hands. So if you were in the front of the line, you didn't want to be there because the soup would be very hot and you would either burn your mouth or you would drop it. And you didn't want to be in the far end of the line because the soup would be either gone or it would be cold. And so you wanted to be in the middle of the line. And you wanted to have a spoon because you would try to organize, this is what they called it, organizing. You would try to organize something that you could put the soup in so that you could then go somewhere and eat in peace and get some nourishment. This is one of the treasures that we saw. My dad saved almost everything. It's kind of amazing. this will probably end up being donated to one of the Holocaust museums. I don't even know exactly when or where. But evidence of the atrocities did filter out. This is one of the very famous Sonderkommando photos. The Sonderkommando in this case is not associated with the Einsatzgruppen, but is actual Jewish prisoners who were in charge of dealing with the death and destruction that these concentration camps wrought. And this is one of those photos where they killed so efficiently, there was no room in the ovens to burn people. So they dug a pit and they were burning bodies in the pit. Hundreds. The smell was absolutely horrible, and it never ended. It was a constant. The chimneys were, the flames would come out the top of the chimneys. These chimneys were very tall. The fires needed to burn bodies were so hot and were fed so much fuel. The smoke would come out of the chimneys, and it was so heavy from the burning of human flesh that the smoke would sink. And so the camp was almost always covered in this stench. This is a very blurry photo of the liquidation of the women's camp, and it's a good thing that it's blurred, because as you can see, these poor souls are emaciated beyond belief and are basically marching to their own demise. As I mentioned before, Jan Karski had infiltrated the Auschwitz camp and talked to a number of prisoners and basically fomented a resistance inside the camp. And so as part of that resistance, in October of 1944, a group of prisoners who were Sonderkommando, they had found out and been told that they were to be killed. And instead of taking it lying down, they decided to revolt. And so weapons and gunpowder were smuggled to them over several weeks. And on the 7th of October, 1944, the revolt happened, and they were able to actually blow up one of the crematoriums, which would slow down their ability to, burn bodies. Almost 500 prisoners were killed in that revolt. I think 3 or 4 SS were killed. That's about it. There were a group of Jewish female prisoners who smuggled the gunpowder, and they were somehow found out, and they were hung in the following weeks after the revolt. This is a picture of the ovens. There were multiple sets of these ovens in the facility, and you can see people still go there and leave flowers. And you'll notice on my dad's jacket, this little patch here is called, the Germans call them Winkel, which I think is a word meaning triangle. But this is the Winkel on this uniform, and this says politisch, and this is a political prisoner. Now, normally my dad would have had one of these, indicating that he was Jewish, but as I just told you, he got rid of his jacket and got someone else's. So now when someone looked at him, he was not Jewish, he was a political prisoner, which again, maybe part of the miraculous reason he survived. But they had categories for everyone: political prisoners, criminals, immigrants, and these are people who left Germany but then came back, and they were basically suspected of being spies, so they were imprisoned. There was another term, literally translated, means Bible researchers. These were Jehovah's Witnesses. They just didn't like them. I mean, they didn't like Catholics. They didn't like anybody, really. Homosexuals, vagrants, Roma, Jews, all of these people were labeled as some sort of, these are subhumans, these are undesirables. They even had a category for this designation means that you were a male Jew and you had intimate relations with an Aryan. This one is you were a female Jew and you had intimate relations with an Aryan. These are very psychotic people. This patch is for Poles, Czechs. They had another one for that had S on it. And if you recall, the Spanish Civil War was the testing ground for the Nazis. This is the first place they were testing their tanks and their planes and things. And many of the Spanish Civil War fighters who fought against Franco, they ended up in concentration camps. This is a picture of my father speaking to another survivor. And before I get any further, I want to tell you something very quick. At one point in my dad's term in Auschwitz, he was in an isolation cell. He did something, he was punished, put in an isolation cell. In the cell next to him was someone else. And at one point they said to him, they said, don't lose your faith, keep your hope alive, you know, we'll get through this, so forth. My dad found this to be very strange. He's just like, who is this person? Whatever. And he really never thought about it again. And we'll come back to that at some points very soon. This is inside the sort of the museum at Auschwitz. These are shoes from victims of the Nazi campaign to eliminate the Jewish population. These are eyeglasses. These are prosthetics and braces off of prisoners. This is luggage. And these are shaving brushes. They used to use a shaving brush to apply shaving cream to your face. There's rooms and rooms and rooms full of this stuff. These are all victims' belongings. This is my dad's concentration camp tattoo. This is a pretty low number, really. When you see people's arms and their numbers, a lot of times you'll see, you know, there's 6, 7 numbers on the arm. This is a very low number. This is an identification document that was given to him after the war. This, of course, is his concentration camp uniform, and next to it is his U.S. Army uniform. This is a similar map to the one that's posted over there on the wall. This highlights extermination camps, main city ghettos, and major concentration camps in Poland. And you can see the map is pretty covered up with these types of camps and ghettos and such. The other map over there is got a lot more stuff on it. A lot more details to go into about Auschwitz, but because of time constraints, I won't be talking about those. But later on, again, another transport, and my dad, yeah, get me out of here. And so, again, from the frying pan into the fire, this is Dachau. And I just found this map not too long ago, and I was just absolutely blown away by the number of subcamps. So my dad was in Dachau. He was also in this camp, Kaufering. He was in this camp, Landsberg. He was in this camp, Augsburg. And he was also in a place that's not listed on here called Weingatt 2. And this is a place that he described as the worst place that he had been experienced in his young years. Weingatt 2, of course, they never knew the names of the places they were. They were just, you know, that's where you are and that's what you did. He knew it as the Messerschmitt-Werke. So this was an underground facility that the Germans made to build airplanes and airplane engines and such. The reason I knew this was the right place is because of this picture right here. So I was searching under the wrong keywords, and I used all sorts of keywords: underground bunker, Messerschmitt-Werke, you know, Nazis killing people using cement, blah, blah. Anyway, I found nothing, and then just happened upon this name, Weingatt 2, and I knew this was I knew it was the place. So, and the reason I knew this is because my dad described the fact that they were forced to carry 80-pound sacks of concrete on boards up over a concrete mixer that's probably was about the size of this room, at least from where the books are to that wall. And of course, the planks were very rickety and there was only one plank. So these poor individuals who were weakened from starvation and beatings and breathing cement dust would just fall into the cement and become part of the concrete. And this is a memorial piece that is part of Weingut now. And these are pictures of the Weingut 2 facility. Weingut means in German vineyard, if you can imagine such a thing. The SS guards at Weingut would literally laugh when guys fell into the concrete. So toward the end of the war, the Nazis were really trying to hide what they had done, but their atrocities accelerated tremendously. Let me go back a couple here. Okay, so this is a photo from Kaufering and from Landsberg, and this is kind of interesting because this is Colonel Seilers of the US 12th Armored Division. They liberated this area, and outside of the camp area are towns where German people bake their bread and have their dinners and go to church and do whatever they do. Nobody admitted that they knew what was going on here. And again, the stench, there's no way to not know what was happening here. So this guy, great guy. He dragged all of the townspeople into the camp and basically lectured them and then made them clean up the mess. So these are German citizens from a town called Herrlich, which are under the watchful eye of US Army troops being forced to bury the dead. As I was saying, their atrocities accelerated greatly toward the end of the war. And like so many others, my dad was put into a death march, and they marched to an area in Bavaria where they were to be executed. And I'm going to let my dad basically tell you about his liberation. I'm so thankful that we have this recording. This is kind of a nice surprise and everything.
Just clear.
Yeah, right.
Liberation.
Obviously, the war was coming to an end, and the Germans decided to eliminate all the witnesses of atrocities, so they decided to kill us all. We, at one point, the crew that guarded us in Messerschmitt factory was replaced by a die-hard SS group. They came in, surrounded the camp, took 500, they divided us forcefully into 500 people and marched us off into unknown. That really was a dead march, because anybody that couldn't walk fast enough and struggle behind or fell down because they were exhausted and from malnourishment, they were shot in the back. But the SS were not caring if they leave the dead people laying. After the march, we were quartered for the night in an empty barn, huge barn, and suddenly 6 o'clock or even before that, it was still dark, and the barn door flew open, and we were beaten out, literally, out of the barn into the ground and marched another half a mile. The name of the area later I found out was Birkach, B-I-R-C-H-I, that's it, Birkach. That's the wood. It was a young wood. We know this grave being already dug for us. They surrounded us, the SS, guards surrounded us with a machine gun, and they told us to lay down, which we did. And the interesting thing was that shortly after we laid down, obviously the pilot, reconnaissance pilot, flying over the woods, spotted these blue and white stripes, like a carpet between the trees. Obviously, that's how he had to identify it, because shortly after that, he circled the area and pink smoke was let out of the plane. The smoke was slowly disappearing, but not very fast. And he marked the whole area. And we wondered, what was this all about? Are they gonna bomb us? We didn't know what was going on. But about 35, maybe 40 minutes after that, suddenly we hear the clickety clocks of the tanks and engines nearing by. The interesting thing was that the Germans very seldom would do something without an order. So the SS, later on we learned, waited for the order to shoot us, but the order never came. So they kept guarding us. In about a minute or two after that, the tanks appear with the jeeps leading and American GIs appearing, and there is a loudspeaker on a jeep, and in a perfect German, one of the GIs is saying to the SS in a loudspeaker, he said, if you harm even one prisoner, we will shoot you all on the spot. Make sure that nothing happens here. If you behave, everything will be okay. And the SS were paralyzed. For a moment, they didn't know what to do. They abandoned the machine guns, and they got together to really have a powwow or decide what to do. And when they were grouped together, they were among us, there were Soviet prisoners who were obviously well trained. Suddenly we heard, hurrah, zabi banditos, which means, hooray, let's attack the bandits. And they all got up at one time and attacked the group that was standing there, talking the SS. They beat them up, they pushed them on the ground, they trampled them, and we got up and we ran also. And we actually ran over the SS. If any of them were trampled to death, don't know, perhaps. But anyway, what
Where'd you run to?
we were just running, and the GIs were showing us, gesticulating, go this way, go, go.
Telling you to run behind the tanks?
Exactly. And what happened then is that we didn't have a chance to retain these people. But as we were running, one of the soldiers had a guitar, and he was standing on a tank, and he was strumming and singing this song, Don't Fence Me In.
Yeah, that's a Soul Porter song.
Yeah, that's the first time I have ever heard that song, and it was wonderful. But we were running to freedom, and we were completely crazed. The only thing we wanted to do is get away into freedom, and it was crazy. And about 600 yards, I spotted a jeep, and there was a German officer, SS lieutenant, guarded by American sergeant. the American sergeant had a Thompson in his hand, and the German was sitting on the hood of a Jeep.
A Thompson machine gun.
Yes, Thompson machine gun. The sergeant is yelling at me, Polski, Polski, or Ruski, what are you? Because I didn't know English at this point, but I got it together. I said, Polski. So he says, come here, come here, come here. So I'm traipsing to him. I start running. He hands me the Thompson submachine gun. He cocks it and he said, shoot, shoot, schießen, schießen, and points on his head.
Shoot the SS officer.
Exactly. I grabbed the machine gun and I said, ah, to myself quietly in my brain, this is my chance. This is what I'm gonna get rid of, my whole anger and hatred. That's what I was thinking about. I grabbed the gun, I put the machine gun pretty close, and I see the German's eyes just got glassy, and I could see fear in his eyes. He was visibly shook that the guy in his striped uniform is gonna shoot him now. I think that's what he was thinking. And this happens probably in a minute, but my brain seemed to be acting as it would be at least 30 minutes. I had these thoughts going through. Should I not? Should I not? And I wanna, my final thought before I decided was, what crazy thing you're going to do? You're gonna shoot one man? Is this gonna bring your father back, your mother back, all the other people that were shot? No, that's crazy. And so I had my finger on the trigger. I released my finger, I completely relaxed, and I gave the Thompson submachine gun back to the sergeant, and I say thank you in Polish, but I'm not going to do what they did. And that was my decision. And it was a moment of an epiphany, so to speak, you know.
There's a lot more of that, and you can find that. We go back to the program, Mackenzie. If you just look up my dad's name, you'll find that the guy who made that film's named Gary Hendershot, and I think it's called B4112 Historical Documentation, and there's a lot more there that I'd love to play for you, but time constraints. I think I'm already a little bit over, but we're gonna jump through this stuff. So he was liberated by this one of these are called tank destroyer units, and for many years afterward he would go to these reunions and try to identify the actual unit that liberated him. But this picture was repeated over and over and over again all throughout the areas that both the Allies and the Soviets liberated. And this is exactly what happened with my dad and his brother. My dad was carrying Zygmunt away from the execution fields. German soldiers were dropping their uniforms, dropping their guns, and getting in civilian clothes to escape the inevitable. And my dad picked up one of those pistols, and they went to a small German village. There was a group of about 20 prisoners that had sort of gathered together. And my dad went from door to door saying, help us, we need help. We're near death. We need food, we need shelter. And the Germans turned them away and refused to help them. So my dad pulled the pistol out and put it right in the face of one of these guys and said, you are going to help us, or I am going to shoot you and your family, and I'm going to go door to door and shoot everyone until we get some help. And I believe he would have done it. They were desperate. So the German guy, oh, yes, 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 yes. And so they were able to organize homes for all of these guys to stay in, and they were fed and cared for, and they recuperated for the most part. Zygmunt was very ill. He had to go to a hospital. He was suffering from typhus and a number of other issues. This is a photograph of the liberation of Mauthausen. And of course, you know, these photographs, that people didn't have cell phones, people didn't have cameras back then. These were people who had been deprived of every single belonging they ever had. So it's actually pretty rare to find photographs depicting the liberation of camps. But in every single instance, this is what they found. People who had been starved, beaten, mistreated, children who had been starved and experimented on. This is actually the color of the skin. This is some sort of weird malady that the Nazis were experimenting with. These kids probably did not survive. These are the bunks. This is how they found people in their bunks, many of them dead, many of them near death. There were numerous massacres. This is a massacre called the Gardelegen massacre. And just like my father, the SS put him in a barn, and instead of walking him out in the morning and taking him to an execution field, they just burned the barn down. So all these guys, these are all bodies of prisoners who were burned alive inside of this barn. This is a picture again at Mauthausen, and these are victims of experimentation. It was not just in Auschwitz where people like Mengele experimented on people. These are guys who probably were tortured and experimented on. They did a lot of experiments on like freezing people. Like they wanted to know what would happen if a pilot went into the North Sea, as if you couldn't figure that out. And people suffered grievous injuries. All these people had their legs amputated. A lot of these people, in fact, probably most of these people, ended up in what's called DP camps. These were camps for displaced persons. This is my dad's actual DP identification card, along with, this is another card that he was issued by the Allies after the liberation. This is another document. It's an identity card. That's his photograph. This is sometime after his liberation with his thumbprint and all sorts of data over here. Again, another certificate. This is an international certificate that was issued to him. This was his last prison, was a subcamp of Dachau, which is, as I said, Weingut 2. Immediately after sort of recovering, he joined the Polish army. He anticipated going back to Poland, and at that time, the communist Stalin basically said, "Oh, of course we'll have free elections in Poland." Of course, this was all nonsense. So he trained with this Polish army unit, and there were many of these units in occupied territory, now occupied by the U.S. Army. And this was his unit. And at one point, they were told they were going to be shipped back to Poland and take on their role as the Polish army. And so they got on a train and they were heading to Poland ostensibly. But a number of people recognized that at a certain critical juncture, the train was going the wrong way. And so my dad, along with maybe a dozen other guys, they jumped off the train. And it's probably a good thing. Well, it is a good thing. He survived. And the rest of the Polish army units that went on that train were executed by the NKVD. That's the Soviet secret police. So he made it back to the camp. And of course, they were very angry and accused the Americans of somehow being part of that. And the Americans, of course, were like, "Hey, we know nothing about it." And so he was offered, like, "Where do you want to go? You want to go to the US? Yes. So this is my father and his brother on the Liberty boat. And this is the first picture that they took upon arrival in New York. That's, of course, Lady Liberty in New York Harbor. Again, my dad, having recovered from his camp days, and his brother, and we eventually found through other survivors and a few relatives. Remember earlier I asked you to think about your families when all this was going on. My dad's family was approximately 55 people. It was a big family. And that's his extended family on both his mom and his dad's side. Out of 55 people, 6 survived. That was it. 6. So anyway, we did find this photograph of Lila, that's his mother, but we have never found to this day a picture of his father, Leon. A few pictures of him when he was a child were found. This is my dad, and this right here is Richard. And there he is in a canoe. When he first showed me this picture, I was like, I don't remember this. He goes, yeah, because it's not you, it's me. I was like, oh. Shortly after arriving in the US, he was very grateful to the US Army and was extremely enthused about joining. And so he did. And he quickly made sergeant rank, and this was his nickname, Sergeant Snap. And this is him right here with his, he basically was put in charge of an anti-aircraft quad 50 unit on a half track. That's the half track behind with the 50 cals on the back of it. Again, these are pictures. I will tell you where this picture is in a second, but he really loved his time in the Army. This is him in the, can't really see him that well, but that's him acting tough in his helmet there. Again, this is a photo of him in his half track. And now this is the irony of it. He was in the 43rd, and one of his little pendants is over there in the display case. But strangely enough, and this just so typifies the US military. So where do you think they sent him once he finished, boot camp and training and everything? They sent him right back to Germany. In fact, they sent him to Augsburg, which was the second to the last camp that he was in. So they literally sent him right back into the same place that he was imprisoned as a concentration camp. So that was kind of ironic. There he is, kneeling down in this photograph. Upon ending his time in the Army, he enrolled in the University of Rhode Island, where he graduated in '56. This is his graduation. And he basically took on a normal American life. Now, he had an accent, and of course, I couldn't really hear his accent, but anyone who would meet him knew and talk, they'd go, wow, what an accent. I'm like, really? This is my sister. She was born in '56. That's me when I was really young and a lot more cute. They had a true love story, a true romance. My dad had a summer job up in Old Orchard Beach at a resort, and my mom, standing here, was a waitress in that same restaurant. She was a cheerleader in high school, and they really hit it off. The sort of the pivotal event in their courtship, he was a cook, and one day he splashed some very hot oil on his arms, and she was the only waitress who knew how to drive. And there was this old beat up pickup out back that the stick shift was actually broken, so there wasn't any kind of handle on it. It was just the metal stick, and she drove him to the hospital, and that was sort of the end of it. That they were inseparable after that. They got married, and like I showed you previously, they had a family. There's my sister, and that's me looking pretty dopey. I even had a crossed eye when I was young. Don't tell my wife that. She divorced me or something. This is our house in Waterloo, Iowa. This is where I spent most of my time growing up. And this is my dad and his great granddaughter. This is in Atlantic Beach in the not too distant past. And this is kind of isn't the whole clan, but it's most of us all together. And I want to stress something to you, and this is going to sound weird, but all of this information that I just imparted to you over the course of this presentation, this was all completely secret. I knew nothing about this. I mean, I saw his tattoo on his arm, and he would just like, oh, we were political prisoners. My dad was a lawyer, wasn't that big a deal. I don't want to talk about it. So I knew none of this. And then again, unbeknownst to me, in the early 60s, my dad filed a lawsuit against the communist government of Poland and fought and fought and fought and fought and fought. And then the wall came down in, I guess it was 89, and fought some more and fought some more. And in 1996, he actually won the legal battle to get his house back. And so in that year, I think the little light bulb went off like, I've got to tell Mark and Karen, that's my sister, I guess I really have to divulge this information because, he's going to have to take care of this place, not me. And so in 96, he, without really telling me much, said, oh, we're going to Poland. I won the court battle finally. I'm, going to get the house back. What? I had no idea what his house looked like. So we went back in 96. And while we're in Poland, he basically dumps this story on me. And I'm like, it was really shocking. I mean, it was really shocking. But he didn't dwell on it. In fact, he didn't give me time to dwell on it. He had all these other things planned. So we stayed about a week. 20 minutes. Oh my God, I better hurry up. Okay, thank you. So anyway, all of this was secret. And it's secret for a really interesting reason. And that is, he thought the same thing that happened to him in Poland could happen here. And in 96, I would have laughed at you if you'd have told me that. But I'm not laughing today. Not at all. So remember the statue I told you about that was destroyed? This is the one, and it was reconstituted. This is my dad. He went back to Poland in 76 while it was still under communist rule. And I'm kind of surprised that they didn't arrest him because his brother was in the Army Krajowa, the underground, and anyone associated with that generally was considered very suspicious. Now, he almost did get arrested. That's a story for another time, but he made it back and his fight went on. And like I said, we got back his property. There was a massacre in the forest of Katyn that the Soviets killed about 40,000 Polish lawyers, doctors, political figures, anyone who could foment a resistance against the communists, they were killed. And so this is him honoring the victims of the Katyn massacre. Now, the other interesting thing about the Katyn massacre was that the Germans blamed the Russians and the Russians blamed the Germans. So finally, in, I guess it was 2009, the Russians finally admitted that they had done it. And in 2010, strangely enough, on my birthday, on April 10th, 2010, the entire Polish government got on a plane that was serviced by the Soviet Union, and they flew to Smolensk to honor the victims of the Katyn massacre. And if you recall, the airplane carrying the entire government of Poland crashed and all were killed. Now, some may think that is a terrible aviation accident. I myself don't believe that. I believe Vladimir Putin killed those people. And I think there's evidence to that. And even though the Polish government, I think currently is kind of crazy and a little bit unhinged, I think they're right about that. I do think that Vladimir Putin had something to do with that crash. And this is an actual picture from the Katyn massacre where all these bodies were being basically were discovered, and archaeologists were working on them. This is my dad at Pulmonary Cemetery. And let me once again stress to you the oddity and the cruelty that the whole Nazi regime was just part of. Their of course, you'll remember the 1936 Olympics were in Berlin. There was a Polish athlete, track and field athlete, who did very well, won gold medal. The minute Germany occupied Poland, they hunted this guy down, murdered him. And he's buried in this cemetery. We're actually looking for his grave when I took this picture. This is my dad and myself at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. And this is at the end of the railhead. And we just sort of took this as a symbolic picture. And this is near the ovens. It was sort of like a stick it. You didn't get my dad. This is at the Schindler Museum. This was kind of a weird, his reflection was in the window, so I quickly snapped a shot. It came out pretty good. My dad never believed that the communists could break the spirit of Poland, and he was right. They're free now, even though, like I said, the government is, I don't know what to say about them. They've actually instituted laws that make it a crime for you to make any sort of negative statement about Poland during World War II. It's really odd because, war brings out the best and the worst in people. There were certainly Poles that did incredibly heroic things during the war. There were also Poles who did really terrible things during the war. But they don't want to hear about that. In fact, I could probably get in trouble just for saying that. This is a picture of my mom and dad at their 50th wedding anniversary. They were very happy couple, generally very happy people, although in the later years, I discovered that my dad had a lot of like post-traumatic stress, and you can see why from what he went through. This is shortly before my dad passed, and unfortunately, my mom was suffering from Alzheimer's, and that just crushed him. He was not. He did not deal well with my mom's illness, and in some ways it's a blessing he passed before she did. But the guy at the funeral home saw the concentration tattoo on my dad's arm and did an interview with the paper, and he sort of dubbed my father as the indomitable spirit, and he was something else. There's a picture of us taken many years ago when I was, I don't know, probably 4 or 5. He enjoyed drinking beer and eating good food and having parties. He was always involved in bringing people together and having a good time. He loved dancing with my mom. In July of 2018, I flew him back to Poland as part of a book signing event for his book, which that means one of many. That's the name of his book. And he did sort of a Q&A. This is the guy who translated the book, and this is a professor at the university. It was fun for him. It was really good. I flew him out there first class. He'd never flown first class before because he was, having gone through the war, he was a little bit tight. He didn't want to spend money. But this is a copy of his book. I'm actually trying to get it published in English, but without success so far. This is at his 91st birthday party. The fact that he lived till 91 is a sort of a poke in the eye of the Nazis, as far as I'm concerned. And again, this is taken in the late summer of 2019 at our house. And he got a military funeral with a rifle salute. We had a very nice ceremony for him. He had a miraculous journey through life, and his early history, of course, is extremely difficult and painful, but he overcame all of that and had a pretty amazing life where he was a person who helped other people. He was a psychiatric social worker and spent his life basically helping others. And normally I would end the presentation here, but we live in different times. And years ago, there was an artist, I won't mention his name, but his initials are Frank Zappa. And he wrote a song called "It Can't Happen Here." And this is really applicable because it can happen here, and it has been happening. over the last few years. And then this is a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery in Europe somewhere, and someone has come in and spray painted Jude raus and a swastika on the gravestone. This means Jews out. And here I've kind of blanked out the profanity, but it starts with an F. And over here, you'll see 88. And I don't know if any of you know that, but 88 is a designation that means Heil Hitler. And it's hard to see, but right here it says, Allah bless Hitler. And these are, you know, commonplace things found in Europe. But strangely enough, it's not the only place it's happening. This is the Conservative Political Action Conference of 2021. And let me show you this. This is the lapel of an SS officer during World War II. This rune here is called an odal rune. And this was a very common rune used by the Nazis. And this is the stage at the 2021 conference. Now, what does that look like to you? That is that rune right there. There's no mistake about it. That is the odal rune. Now, that's ballsy to come right out and have a stage designed like a Nazi insignia. That is ballsy. So why is this so controversial? Why does this create a reaction in me and others who've seen this? It's because this root, this odal rune, was used in the National Socialist Movement's flag. This rune replaced the swastika on the neo-Nazis in the US. And this, oh my God, finish. All right, so this is another campaign poster. If you'll see, I won't mention this traitor's name, but up here, superimposed on the flag is money, and then the White House, and then soldiers. So monetary power, political power, military power. There's only one problem with this, and that is the soldiers in this picture are Nazis. Now, why in heavens would you put Nazi soldiers superimposed on an American flag? We had thousands of US troops die fighting fascists, and this guy used Nazi soldiers on his campaign slogan. It's not just people on the right. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The Kennedys are kind of my heroes when I was young. This is Robert Kennedy Jr. And he was suggesting that things are worse for people today than they were for Anne Frank. That's the teenager who died in Nazi concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. I'm going to end with this statement. If you believe in the American system and you believe in the Constitution, then you have to fight. Be it small or in a large way, you have to fight, because this is how fascism takes hold. We've seen the playbook and it's happening again. This is a very important quote. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that is exactly what happened in Germany in 1933, and it's happening again today as we speak. And with that, I will end, and I will take questions for as long as we can stay here. I'm willing to stay for as long if the library doesn't kick us all out.
But many people who said thank you and appreciate your story.
Okay.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Wow, questions? Yes.
How old was your father when he entered his first prison camp, and how old was he when he was liberated?
He was, there is some, a little bit of controversy about his birth date. On some documents, it's listed as 1927, on some it's 25, and truthfully, he doesn't really remember that well. I believe it's 1927 is his birthday. So he was 11 years old at the outbreak of the war. So he was 11, 12 years old when he went into the first camp. And of course, that was 1940. So 5 years onto that, he was like 15 or 16 when he was liberated.
Yeah, you touched on something. You said that the civilians, their involvement.
Mhm.
Do you feel that that is something that's understated or kind of, I guess you'd say, slanted
Oh,
or
yeah.
misrepresented as far as their involvement?
Yeah, no one ever talks about the fact that, you know, this was an actual policy. The Nazis purposefully sort of incited stuff, and police under Nazi control and these sort of paramilitary groups were allowed to do this stuff, and the Nazis just kind of watched and giggled about it. They thought, oh, these people are doing our dirty work, and they let it happen for months and months on end. And then finally, at some point, someone in the Nazi hierarchy said, you know, we probably should put a stop to this. This is a little bit disorderly. And the Germans loved order. So they wanted very strict policies in place. You know, they documented everything. They wanted the names. They wanted the information about all the people they killed. So yes, it was a policy to allow civilians and other people to commit such atrocities. Yeah. Pete.
When your father was alone, you said there was somebody in a cell next to
Oh,
him.
So I forgot to tell that story, like I have all sorts of time. But when he was in Dachau, again, he was in an isolation cell, and the same voice came to him saying the same exact words. Don't give up hope, don't lose your faith, blah, blah, blah. My dad was like, who are you? And the guy says, I'm Father Hart, and I'm a Catholic priest. And he says, were you in Auschwitz? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, my God, you said the same thing to me in Auschwitz. And, you know, later on, after my dad was liberated and came to the US, he actually ran into this guy again. And he converted to Catholicism. So that's, I didn't finish that story. I forgot to get back to that. I think they're signaling that we're out. Oh, yeah.
You said the signature would become important later.
Oh, see, another one I mentioned. So in the lawsuit, there was a Russian mafia actually took control of the house before we could. And so there was another lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, this Russian mafia guy basically said, well, I have papers that prove that I bought this legally from the owner, Lil Friedemann. And so he produced this document, and of course the signature was nothing like the signature on that page. So the court, before they could even rule, the Polish police rushed into the courtroom and grabbed this guy and hauled him out. And the judge was like, what are you doing? And the police officer said, this man was implicated in a armored car robbery where the guards were killed, and we have proof that he did it, and he's going to the jail. And the judge kind of looked at my dad and said, you win. And that was it. Game over. We got the house. We finally took control of the house in 2001. So yeah, that's that. Any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sorry I went over time. My bad.
Please make sure that maybe, not tonight, but we do have artifacts that he has brought from his father's life that are on display, and they will be on display until the 31st. So, take time, come back again, and please check them out. We also have a few little snacks over there if you want to grab something on your way out. And thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your father's story.
You're
It's
welcome.
amazing.
Thank you all for coming. Very pleased to see you all.
Thank you very much. I did
Sure.
Auschwitz 2 years, just for the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I was there today, and I thought, what must it be like when it's cold and rainy?
Yeah.
But it was amazing. I took one of those small guided tours for like 6 hours. So, big World War II.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Jewish Museum in Warsaw.
Yeah, I have not been there.
Well, I spent 6 hours before I even got to the World War II part.